The story you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts featuring historical characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you. Based on some of the articles I've read through the years, when reading the description of people who kill, their victims are mentioned briefly. What I mean by this is whenever an article is written about the killer, they give all this information about him or her, like where he or she is from, his or her life story, how old he or she is, and speculation as to why this killer did what he or she did. And the victims? Nothing. Sometimes the article will just say, Jane Doe, age so-and-so, killed, then proceeds to give us the gory details. I have a feeling that whoever wrote those articles wrote it that way because it helps them distance themselves from the real person whose life was cut short by these individuals. This is not the case with Elizabeth Short. The way her mutilated body was found will forever be in history as California's most famous unsolved case, and because of the unprecedented brutality of her murder. Before she was killed, Short had been forced to eat feces. Flesh and pubic hair had been shaved off her body and inserted into her vagina and rectum. Short's uterus was removed. Long gashes extended her mouth into an eerie smile. Before her murder, Elizabeth lived a nomadic lifestyle. She was born and raised in Medford, Massachusetts. Her father, Cleo Short, faked his own suicide in order to leave his family and wife. When Elizabeth was 18, having learned that her father was actually alive and well and living in Vallejo, California, she decided she would join him. According to Cleo's interview with the police soon after Elizabeth's murder, the two had an agreement. Elizabeth could stay, but she would cook and keep the house clean and generally be a live-in housekeeper for Cleo. The arrangement only lasted about 3 weeks. Cleo said Elizabeth had a habit of running around, stayed out late, and generally did all the things people in the 1940s associated with bad women. So, he sent Elizabeth packing, and at the time of her murder, hadn't seen her since. During his interview with police, he was allegedly drunk, belligerent, and said he didn't care that she'd been murdered. He wouldn't even go to the coroner's office to identify her body. After she left her father, Elizabeth spent about 7 months working at Camp Cook, California, in the Post-Exchange. A Los Angeles Police Department report details Elizabeth's nomadic movements. She went to Florida in 1944 and 1945. And then went back home to Medford, Massachusetts. Elizabeth stayed there with her mother until March of 1946, at which point she went to Long Beach, California. This is where law enforcement began to struggle following her numerous address changes. Elizabeth moved around to about a half a dozen different addresses in less than a year, and those were just the ones law enforcement could find. In some cases, she stayed for a few scant weeks before packing up and moving again, mostly in the Hollywood area. Throughout her time as a wandering wannabe starlet, Elizabeth seemed to fascinate the people whose lives she moved in and out of. Dorothy French knew nothing about Elizabeth, yet she was so taken in by her that she let Elizabeth stay in her home for weeks. Similarly, Anne thought, another woman who happened upon Elizabeth and took her in, told police she was impressed by her story of not having a place to stay, so she invited Elizabeth to live with her for a time. Elizabeth left Dorothy on January 8, 1947, just a week before her murder, with a man called Red, also known as Robert Manley.
Police soon blanketed the area in what became a frenzied but fruitless search for clues. estimated to have been placed there sometime before dawn. The body was that of a young girl, thought to be around 17 years of age, with recently dyed hair, its reddish-brown tint giving way to its original color of black, visible at the roots and just beginning to grow back out. The victim had been severed in two with an almost surgical-like precision. No blood was visible either on or around the body, indicating the killing had taken place elsewhere. Both halves had been meticulously scrubbed clean, with bristles from the brush found still embedded in her flesh. Rope and wire burns covered the wrists, ankles, neck, and upper right thigh, indicating the victim had been trussed up and tortured prior to death. A deep gash on the victim's upper left thigh would later reveal that the killer had seemingly taken it upon himself to remove a rose.
Elizabeth was someone who fell in love with people easily. She could please them and make them feel comfortable with her. It was a skill that was probably a combination of natural charisma and survival instinct. When she decided to live in California, without a job or connections, Elizabeth needed people who were willing to move their own lives around to make space for her. Despite the fact that she was a charmer, there's no hard evidence that Elizabeth was deceitful or a temptress, but the press didn't care. It wanted and needed her to be something of its own creation. Described as lovely, innocent, and shy in 1943 when she first came to California for her health, the black-haired beauty had changed to a man-crazy adventuress during her 3 years of gay living in 4 Southern California cities, wrote one California newspaper. In most articles, the reporter is sure to identify Elizabeth as the attractive victim or attractive brunette, or pretty Elizabeth Short, among many other variations of the same. The press was fascinated not only with the brutality of the crime, but the fact that this happened to a beautiful young woman. A beautiful young woman who had a darkly glamorous nickname that was just perfect for selling stories. Who gave Elizabeth Short her now infamous nickname? Men, of course. Different newspaper articles and sources gave slightly different reasons for the nickname. The Los Angeles Times said it was because of the flower-like arrangement of her jet black hair and affinity for black garments. Elizabeth Short had supposedly 2 goals in life then: be a movie star or a military man's wife. There were evidences that she did seem to be around a lot of military men in the few years leading to her death. There were letters found in Elizabeth's trunk of personal effects, many of them from soldiers or other men in the military. There was a telegram among her personal effects that alerted her to the death of Major Matthew Gordon, who was killed overseas. It was said that they were engaged, but no one knows for sure. Fuel was added to the boy-crazy narrative when law enforcement arrested their first suspect, a man initially identified only as Red. Red was the last known person to see Elizabeth alive, which made him a person of interest in the case. His real name was Robert Manley. He was a 25-year-old married salesman with orangish hair, a slender build, and large ears. His hair was cropped at the sides and thick on top, a style that many men still sport today. He also happened to be a former army musician, so he fit what people claimed to be Elizabeth's type. Manley picked up Elizabeth on January 8, 1947, while she was staying with Dorothy French. When Dorothy said goodbye to Elizabeth, she only knew Manley as Red and that he drove a Studebaker. Manley said Elizabeth wanted to go to Los Angeles. They drove for a while, spent the night at a Pacific Beach motel, and he dropped her off the next day at the Biltmore Hotel. It's possible Manley dropped her off there so Elizabeth could sit in the bar and wait for someone to come along and buy her a drink or dinner. Or maybe she simply wanted to impress Red, so she waited until his car was out of sight before leaving the hotel for a different place to stay. Whatever her reason, people claim her ghost haunts the hotel even to this day. Manley was eventually found by police and brought in for questioning late January 1947 after he got back to Los Angeles from a trip to San Francisco. Despite having very little to go on, Donahoe and the Los Angeles Police Department kept Manley for 2 days. On the first day, he reportedly fell asleep while answering questions from an ongoing relay of officers for hours. He also voluntarily took a polygraph test that first day, but the results came back as confused. 2 days later, Manley was released. Police never had much to hold him on. They really just wanted to talk to him while in custody. Captain Jack Donahoe admitted as much when Manley was brought in, saying, "Most of the evidence seems to be on Manley's side." That lack of evidence included no bloodstains found in Manley's car, and he had an alibi that Donahoe said does not appear to have been put together. The criminal profile that the police came up with, the manner in which Elizabeth Short's body was dissected, has indicated the possibility that the murderer was a person somewhat experienced in medical work. The Los Angeles Police Department has undertaken to develop suspects among the medical and dental schools in the area, as well as among other students who have anything to do with human anatomy. At the end of January, 2 people went to law enforcement separately and claimed they had killed Elizabeth. One was Daniel S. Voorhees, a man that in the years since has never really been taken seriously as a suspect. He signed a one-line confession that read, "I did kill Beth Short." This is interesting because Elizabeth was known as Beth to a lot of her friends. So either he knew her well enough to know that, or he just happened to call her by a common nickname. Either way, he refused to elaborate on his confession and was eventually released. While Voorhees was telling police he killed Beth, Emily E. Williams from Tampa, Florida, was talking to San Diego police, claiming that she was in fact the murderer. Williams claims she shot and mutilated Elizabeth because she caught her with her boyfriend. Williams was also dismissed. After all, Elizabeth had never been shot. Then, there was the guy who kept sending postcards and letters to police, claiming to have murdered Elizabeth and wanting to turn himself in. A former Los Angeles Police Department detective, Steve Hodel, spent 15 years cataloging evidence that his dad killed Elizabeth Short. According to him, after his father died, he was sorting through his belongings and he found a photo album tucked away in a box. It was small enough to fit in his palm, and when he looked inside, it contained the usual family pictures. But in the back, there were pictures of a young woman who looked like Elizabeth Short. Of course, Steve is not the first person to claim that he solved this murder, and not even the first to claim that his parent was a killer. But he has a lot of evidence, plus his father, George Hodel, topped the LAPD's list of suspects at the time of the crime. From February 18, 1950 to March 27, 1950, the Los Angeles Police Department monitored Dr. Hodel and put 2 microphones in his home to see if he would make any incriminating statements. The recordings did turn up a few interesting statements, including, "Supposing I did kill her, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." The running theory is that Dr. Hodel killed his secretary via an overdose because she knew about his illegal medical practices, like billing patients for unnecessary treatments and tests, and was going to blackmail him. There was never enough evidence against Dr. Hodel for police at the time to arrest him, and he died in 1999. His evidence includes a handwriting expert who determined that his father's handwriting matching some of the script on notes that the killer sent to the LAPD. Steve also recreated conversations that investigating cops had with their friends and family members who mentioned that they believed the culprit was a doctor, which his father was. The police also had to contend with what they believed to be copycats. By mid-February, there were 4 unusual cases in the 6 weeks since Elizabeth's death, according to an FBI office memorandum to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover from the Los Angeles Special Agent in charge. One of those was Jeannie French. She was a 45-year-old married nurse. Her body was found on a West Los Angeles hilltop. Her mouth had been cut upward at the edges, her body gashed and mutilated. She had been kicked so hard and so many times that her body had heel marks all along it. Her neck and lower right jaw were both broken. A rib pierced her heart, and she'd been found underneath a pile of her clothing. On her torso, the psychopath who murdered her had written BD along with 2 other obscene words in lipstick. Unlike with Elizabeth Short, however, Jeannie had been beaten and kicked to death close to where her body was found, about 12 feet away. She was then dragged across the mud and grass. Police investigated the case as separate murder, never truly drawing any connection to Elizabeth Short other than as a potential copycat. However, the murderer of Elizabeth was very likely a serial killer. While plenty of arrests were made, nothing ever stuck, and Elizabeth's family never saw any sort of closure for her murder. Lingering suspects include Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and wannabe writer who used to moonlight as a mortician's assistant. He got involved in the case in 1948 when he wrote to a Los Angeles Police Department psychiatrist wanting to learn more about the case. He claimed he was writing a book on sadism and sexual psychopaths. Police extensively interviewed him, but they eventually lost interest in Dillon. Then there's Mark Hansen, a nightclub and theater owner who knew Elizabeth. Hansen was one of the last people to talk to Elizabeth before she died when she called him from San Diego. Police said Hansen made contradictory statements when interviewed, but they eventually lost interest in him as well when no evidence came up. Elizabeth Short's murder may never be solved, but we will forever remember her as the Black Dahlia. Hey everyone! I just wanted to express how grateful I am that you took the time to listen to my narration. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I am Twisted Mind, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Salamat!